Imagine you're standing in the middle of a forest 10,000 years ago, and the sky just doesn't stop. Not a quick afternoon shower, not a dramatic thunderstorm that clears up by dinner. We're talking days, weeks maybe, a relentless gray, soul crushing drizzle that turns the ground into soup and your only shelter into a soggy, mildewed disaster. No raincoats, no umbrellas, no weather app buzzing on your wrist telling you, hey, this clears up Thursday. Just you, some wet leaves, and a growing sense that maybe today is the day you finally lose the fight against the elements. So here's the question worth sitting with for a second. How on earth did ancient humans survive that? Not just one soggy afternoon, but entire rainy seasons, monsoon cycles, and multi week deluges, all without a single synthetic fiber to their name. Stick around because the answer involves clever architecture, some surprisingly smart biology, and a few tricks that honestly put modern camping gear to shame. Let's get one thing out of the way immediately, because it's the assumption that trips up almost everyone thinking about this topic. We tend to picture ancient humans as being completely at the mercy of the weather, huddled and shivering, praying to the sky gods for mercy. And sure, there's some truth to that. Weather absolutely could kill you back then, and it did, regularly. But vulnerable to rain and helpless against rain are two very different things, and ancient humans, across basically every rainy environment on the planet, developed an impressive toolkit for dealing with exactly this problem. This wasn't luck. This was engineering, refined over countless generations by people who had a very strong personal incentive not to die of hypothermia in a mud puddle. So let's start with the single most important survival tool ancient humans had against rain. And it's not fire, and it's not clothing. It's shelter, and specifically, it's the incredibly underrated art of picking the right spot to put that shelter in the first place. Modern people, when we think of ancient dwellings, often picture something crude and thrown together at the last second. But the archaeological and anthropological record tells a very different story. Ancient humans were shockingly good geographers when survival was on the line. Take rock shelters and caves, which show up constantly in the archaeological record specifically because they solved the rain problem so effectively. A cave isn't just a hole in a rock. A well-chosen cave, with an overhang that extends out past the entrance, acts like a built-in roof that's been sitting there for thousands of years, completely free, requiring zero maintenance, and immune to wind damage. Sites like the famous rock shelters found across parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia show clear, repeated evidence of long-term human habitation, precisely because these locations offered dry, defensible, temperature-stable real estate in a world with absolutely no other options for either of those things. Ancient humans weren't randomly wandering into caves and getting lucky. They were actively scouting terrain, learning which rock formations produced these natural overhangs, and passing that knowledge down through generations the same way your grandmother passes down a recipe. Except the recipe is don't die in a flash flood. But obviously not every group had a convenient limestone cliff nearby, so for the humans stuck out on open plains, in forests, or near rivers, shelter meant building something from scratch. And this is where things get genuinely impressive, because the engineering behind ancient rain shelters is honestly more sophisticated than most people give it credit for. Let's talk about roofing, because roofing is unglamorously the entire ballgame when it comes to surviving rain. You can have the sturdiest walls in the world, but if water is dripping straight down onto your head all night, you're going to have a miserable, hypothermic time of it. Ancient builders across wildly different cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, independently arrived at remarkably similar solutions to this exact problem, which tells you something important. When the stakes are stay dry or possibly die, human ingenuity converges pretty fast. The first big trick was the steep, pitched roof. If you've ever wondered why so many traditional huts, from thatched cottages in ancient Europe to reed houses in ancient Mesopotamia to bamboo structures across Southeast Asia, all have those dramatically sloped, almost pointy roofs, now you know why. A steep angle means rainwater doesn't have time to pool or seep through gaps. It just slides right off, fast, the same way rain slides off an umbrella instead of soaking through it. Flat roofs, by contrast, are basically an invitation for water to sit there, find every tiny crack and slowly work its way inside, which is exactly the kind of slow motion disaster nobody wants to discover at 3 in the morning during a storm. Then, there's the material itself. And this is where ancient humans got genuinely clever with what nature handed them. Thatching, which is essentially layering bundles of dried grass, reeds, or palm leaves in overlapping rows like shingles, is an absolute masterclass in low-tech waterproofing. Each individual stalk is somewhat water-resistant on its own, but when you layer hundreds of them in overlapping rows, angled downward, you create a surface where water is guided along the outside of each layer and funneled straight off the edge of the roof, never actually reaching the interior. This technique shows up independently in ancient societies across Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Pacific Islands, which is a pretty strong hint that it's not some one-off cultural quirk. It's just really, really good engineering that any sufficiently motivated group of humans will eventually stumble onto when the alternative is sleeping in a puddle. In tropical regions dealing with genuinely relentless monsoon-level rainfall, ancient builders took things even further. Structures were frequently raised up on stilts or wooden posts, lifting the living space entirely above ground level. This solved two problems at once. First, it kept the floor dry even when the ground around it turned into a swamp because, let's be honest, ground-level flooding during a serious monsoon isn't a maybe, it's a guarantee. And second, it improved airflow underneath the structure, which helped combat the mold, rot, and general dampness that comes with living in a permanently humid environment. You can still see the direct descendants of this idea today in traditional stilt houses found throughout parts of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, a design lineage that stretches back thousands of years, refined generation after generation by people who got very, very tired of waking up ankle-deep in water. Now let's talk about something people almost never think about when it comes to ancient rain survival: drainage. Because staying dry isn't just about keeping water out from above, it's also about making sure the water that inevitably does show up has somewhere useful to go instead of just sitting there, festering and slowly undermining everything you've built. Archaeological excavations of ancient settlements, including sites from early farming villages, have revealed deliberately dug drainage channels running alongside dwellings and pathways, specifically designed to redirect rainwater away from living areas and storage pits. This is genuinely next-level thinking. These weren't people just reacting to rain as it happened. They were proactively engineering their entire living space around the assumption that rain was coming and building systems in advance to handle it before it became a crisis. That's not primitive behavior. That's basic civil engineering, thousands of years before anyone had a word for civil engineering. Okay, so shelter and drainage cover the keep the water out side of the equation. But let's flip over to the human body itself, because staying dry is only half the battle. The other half is staying warm, and rain has a nasty, sneaky way of making cold weather dramatically more dangerous than it would otherwise be. This is where things get a little more biologically fascinating and, honestly, a little more nerve-wracking. Here's the uncomfortable science bit. Water conducts heat away from your body roughly 25 times faster than air does. That number is worth sitting with for a second because it explains why a rainy day at, say, 50 degrees Fahrenheit can genuinely be more dangerous than a dry, clear day at 20 degrees. Wet skin, and especially wet clothing, absolutely wrecks your body's ability to maintain its core temperature because that moisture is constantly stealing heat away through evaporation and conduction, way faster than your body can generate replacement heat through basic metabolism. This is precisely why hypothermia, which most people associate with snowy, freezing conditions, is actually a massive risk in cool, rainy environments too. Sometimes even more so, because people don't intuitively feel like 50-degree weather should be life-threatening right up until it very much is. Ancient humans, of course, didn't have thermometers or a technical understanding of conductive heat loss, but they absolutely understood the practical reality of it, because the ones who didn't figure it out tended not to stick around long enough to pass on their genes. Clothing technology adapted specifically to handle this threat, and the solutions varied wildly depending on what materials were locally available, which is honestly one of the coolest parts of this whole story. In regions with access to animal hides, Ancient humans developed genuinely effective rain-resistant garments through techniques like fat rendering and specific tanning processes that made leather significantly more water-resistant than it would be in its raw state. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Some cold climate cultures, particularly in Arctic and subarctic regions, developed incredibly sophisticated waterproof outerwear made from treated animal intestines, of all things. Which sounds bizarre until you realize that properly prepared, this material is remarkably light, flexible, and genuinely waterproof, essentially functioning as an ancient equivalent of modern rain shells made from synthetic membranes. Indigenous Arctic peoples were, quite literally, making functional raincoats out of seal and whale intestine long before anyone had ever synthesized a single plastic polymer. And honestly, given the environment they were dealing with, their version probably had to work a lot harder than yours does. In tropical and subtropical regions where animal hides were less practical due to heat and humidity, plant-based solutions took over. Large leaves, woven grass capes, and palm fiber garments provided surprisingly effective rain protection. And versions of these exact techniques are still used by some traditional communities today, which is a pretty strong endorsement of their effectiveness. There's something almost poetic about the fact that a banana leaf held correctly over your head does a genuinely respectable job of keeping rain off, and ancient humans figured that out through pure trial and error, probably after a lot of very unpleasant, very soggy failures along the way. Fire deserves its own mention here too, because fire wasn't just about warmth and cooking, it was an absolutely critical rain survival tool in its own right. Ancient humans developed real expertise in fire-starting techniques specifically adapted for wet conditions, because a fire that only works on dry days is a fire that fails you exactly when you need it most. Certain woods, and specific parts of certain trees, retain flammability even after exposure to moisture, and this knowledge about which specific bark, which specific dead branches, which specific fungi could reliably catch a spark even when everything around them was soaked, would have been essential, closely guarded survival knowledge passed down within communities. There's also solid archaeological and anthropological evidence that certain groups developed fire-carrying techniques, essentially transporting slow-burning embers, often wrapped in specific types of bark or moss, from one location to another specifically so they wouldn't have to start entirely from scratch if they got caught somewhere without dry tinder during a storm. Think of it as the prehistoric equivalent of always keeping a lighter in your pocket, except losing it wasn't just inconvenient, it could genuinely be a matter of life and death. Let's shift gears for a second and talk about something people almost never consider. Rain wasn't purely a threat. In a lot of ways, ancient humans didn't just survive rain, they actively depended on it, planned around it, and in some pretty remarkable cases, engineered entire societies around harnessing it. Water collection is a great example of this. Ancient peoples in a huge range of environments developed methods for capturing and storing rainwater, specifically because reliable water sources weren't always guaranteed otherwise. Some early societies carved or built cisterns directly into rock or earth, positioned to capture runoff during heavy rainfall, and store it for use during drier stretches. This is a genuinely elegant solution because it turns what could be perceived as a purely dangerous, disruptive event into a resource-gathering opportunity. A multi-day downpour that might seem like pure misery to us today was, to ancient communities with the right infrastructure in place, essentially a free, no-effort water delivery straight from the sky, refilling their reserves for weeks or months to come. And then there's agriculture, which takes this relationship with rain to a whole different level entirely. Once humans transitioned into farming societies, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, their relationship with rain became existential in an entirely new way. Crops need water, obviously, but they need it in the right amounts, at the right times, which meant ancient agricultural societies had to develop genuinely sophisticated systems for reading, predicting, and managing seasonal rainfall patterns. Monsoon-dependent agricultural societies across South and Southeast Asia developed elaborate calendars and cultural practices built entirely around anticipating the arrival of seasonal rains. Because getting that timing wrong wasn't a minor inconvenience, it could mean the difference between a successful harvest and genuine famine for an entire community. Some ancient societies constructed remarkably advanced irrigation and water management systems involving terracing, canals, and reservoirs, specifically designed to capture, store, and distribute rainfall exactly where and when crops needed it most, rather than simply hoping the rain would cooperate on its own schedule. This wasn't reactive behavior anymore. This was long-term generational planning, built around a deep, accumulated understanding of rainfall patterns that had been observed and refined over countless growing seasons. Now, I do want to pump the brakes for a second here, because it would be dishonest to present all of this as some kind of flawless, undefeated triumph of ancient human ingenuity over the weather. Rain absolutely did kill people. Flash floods, in particular, remain one of the most dangerous and unpredictable natural threats even today, with all our modern warning systems and satellite tracking. So you can imagine how much more dangerous they were for ancient communities with no way to predict them beyond watching the sky and reading the landscape. Archaeological evidence at various sites shows signs consistent with flood damage and, in some tragic cases, appears to indicate settlements that were caught completely off guard by sudden, catastrophic flooding events. Prolonged, extreme rainy seasons could also devastate food supplies indirectly by ruining stored grain, triggering crop failures, or making hunting and foraging significantly more difficult and dangerous for extended stretches. And prolonged dampness, even without an outright flood, created serious secondary health risks too, since consistently wet, cold conditions are a prime breeding ground for the kind of respiratory illnesses and infections that, without modern medicine, could turn a survivable situation genuinely lethal, especially for the very young, the very old, or anyone already weakened by injury or malnutrition. So this wasn't some effortless, solved problem where ancient humans shrugged off endless rain without a second thought. It was a serious, persistent, sometimes deadly challenge that required constant vigilance, generational knowledge, and honestly, a fair amount of luck. But here's what makes the story genuinely remarkable rather than just grim. Across wildly different climates, continents, and time periods, with zero communication between most of these groups, ancient humans kept independently arriving at strikingly similar, remarkably effective solutions. Steep roofs, layered waterproof materials, elevated structures, proactive drainage systems, fire management specifically adapted for wet conditions, clothing engineered from whatever water-resistant materials the local environment provided. This kind of pattern, showing up again and again in unconnected societies, isn't a coincidence. It's a direct reflection of just how relentlessly effective necessity is at driving human innovation, especially when the stakes are as brutally simple as figure this out or don't survive the season. There's something genuinely worth appreciating in all of this, especially from where we're sitting today, with our synthetic waterproof jackets, insulated buildings, and weather satellites, orbiting the planet feeding us 5-day forecasts on demand. We tend to think of technological progress as this smooth, steadily climbing line, moving in a straight shot from primitive ignorance toward modern sophistication. But the reality of ancient rain survival tells a much more interesting story than that. These weren't people helplessly waiting around for modern technology to eventually rescue them from the weather. They were actively, cleverly, and often quite elegantly solving an extremely difficult, genuinely life-threatening problem, using nothing but locally available materials, sharp observation, and knowledge painstakingly accumulated and passed down across countless generations. In a lot of ways, that steep thatched roof shedding water off to the side, or that carefully rendered waterproof hide keeping someone dry and warm through a multi-day storm, represents just as much genuine engineering brilliance as anything sitting in a modern hardware store, just built with a completely different toolkit and absolutely zero margin for error. So the next time you're mildly annoyed because you forgot your umbrella and had to jog 50 feet from your car into a building, maybe spare a thought for the ancient humans who faced that exact same sky, that exact same relentless rain, with nothing but a hand-stitched hide, a carefully guarded ember, and generations of hard-won knowledge standing between them and a genuinely miserable, potentially fatal night. They didn't have GPS-tracked storm warnings or synthetic fabrics engineered in a lab. They had ingenuity, observation, and an absolutely ironclad incentive to figure it out fast. And figure it out again and again across every rainy corner of the globe, they very much did.